Hello and welcome to our virtual roundtable at the opening of the EU Studies Association conference held this week in Miami. My name is Marcus Thiel. I'm Professor of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University, Miami's public research university, and we're proud to be an EU sub-partner. And we're thankful for the European Studies Center and the Jean Monnet Center at the University of Pittsburgh, including Ms. Alison Delno for including us in this interesting roundtable. We are living in unsettling times. The election of Donald Trump is being viewed in Europe with shock and disdain. He is either portrayed as a populist policy novice with a steep learning curve that eventually may come down to more moderate policy positions, given his dismal track record this far, or as a perennial and unpredictable narcissist that could turn the US into an authoritarian system and put the rest of the world up in flames. But in Europe, we also have, of course, many issues. Brexit is a very current one. The ongoing refugee and Euro crisis. And, of course, the emergence of vocal populists with their nationalist visions that receive a platform in this momentous election year with at least the big 3 member states of the EU holding elections as well as many others. And this threatens, therefore, not only the future of the European Union, but may also have a decisive impact on transatlantic relations and an impact on the liberal international order more generally. So given these many moving pieces and on both sides, we will here in this panel try to explore what are the implications for all of these factors. We will likely be unable to predict with certainty how the relationship between the EU and the US will develop, but we can surely answer some questions and point to a number of possible scenarios. So here to help us are experts in various fields of transatlantic relations that we invited, and it is my pleasure to welcome them. And I'm going to introduce them now quickly. Let's start with our left here. I have Ms. Kathleen McGinnis. Ms. Kathleen McGinnis currently serves as an international security analyst for the Congressional Research Service, writing on US defense policy and strategy issues. She is also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Prior to these positions, she was at Chatham House in London, working on NATO and transatlantic security matters. Between 2010 and 2012, she co-founded Ceros Associates, a strategic design consulting company. And from 2006 to 2010, McGinnis served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, working on NATO Afghanistan matters. Before joining the Pentagon, she spent several centers at the Center for Strategic International Studies, as well as a researcher in the United Kingdom House of Commons. Ms. Innes was awarded her MSc in International Relations from the LSE in 2002, and she's currently working on her PhD in the Department of War Studies at King College London. Her research focuses on coalition warfare. Thank you and for coming and welcome.
Thank you.
Then here to my right, I have Alistair Young. Alistair Young is a professor in the Semnon School of International Affairs at Georgia Institute of Technology. He's also the co-director of the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies, Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. And importantly here for this week's EU Studies Association, he is a chair of the European Union Studies Association, ending his tenure, I suppose, after this week is over. Saturday. He has written extensively on policy making in the European Union with particular reference to trade policies and on transatlantic relations. His recent publications include Parochial Global Europe, 21st Century Trade Policies, published by Oxford, and a special issue in the Journal of European Public Policy on the EU as a global regulator. So thank you very much for being here and for contributing. And last but not least, we have Michael Smith. Mike is a professor in European politics and politics and international studies at the University of Warwick. He was previously professor of European politics at Loughborough from 1994 to 2015, where he was also head of the department. From 2005 to 2013, he was co-director of the Center for the Study of International Governance there. And importantly, he has been a chair of the University Association for Contemporary European Studies, also known as UASIS, and the Standing Committee of Heads of European Studies. And in 2010, he was honored with the Lifetime Achievement Award in Contemporary European Studies there. He has been a member on the editorial boards of a number of leading journals in our area, such as the Journal of Common Market Studies, the Journal of European Public Policy, and so on and so on. And he also is on the advisory board of 2 book series dealing with the EU as a global actor, including by publishers Routledge and Palgrave Macmillan. Currently, he's working on the 2nd edition of the European Union of the United States, which will come out shortly, I believe next year, but given that there's so many moving pieces, we may have to wait a little bit longer for that piece to appear. So thank you very much for coming, and it is my pleasure. Just to inform you a little bit about what we're going to do in the next hour, we will have each of the panelists will give us a 5-minute overview of their specific points of expertise. And then after that, we'll have a few questions that we want to explore in more depth. And at the end, we want to reserve at least 10 to 15 minutes for questions from here, the audience in Miami at Florida International University, or online as well. And with that being said, if you are joining us online, you can use the chat icon on the right hand of your screen to send us some questions that we will then relay to our panelists. So with further ado, I would ask to please Professor Michael Smith to give us his 5-minute overview of transatlantic relations more generally.
Thanks very much, Marcus.
Thank you.
I'm going to make 4 points, I think. Number 1, that I'm not talking as a British person, I'm talking as a European one. Number 2, that history matters. Number 3, it's all about leadership and followership. And number 4, that Trump's 100 days are not just about governments and in the United States and in Europe. So, first point is a European view, and my interest in European affairs is in governance, order, cooperation and policy making. So you'll understand this is actually quite a difficult period for me because we're not seeing a great deal of either of these things, at least on the surface. It's important to stress that this is not the view of a Brit. In fact, I'm not an untypical Brit, but I'm one of what might be called the 48% in the Brexit context. So you'll have to discount for that particular point of view. Second point, history matters. Obviously, there's been a great deal in the United States press and in Europe, in fact, about the comparison between the current 100 days and the 100 days of previous presidents. And there's a great deal of data about exactly how many people have or have not been nominated or appointed, how many policies have actually been legislated, answer 0, and how many of the executive orders, proclamations and so on that Trump has produced have actually had effects or will have concrete effects. I think the point from a European perspective is that Europeans are always apprehensive about the beginning of a new presidency. Sometimes the apprehension is a kind of positive apprehension, as it was with Barack Obama, where Europeans supported Obama in very large numbers at a distance. And sometimes, of course, it's more of an apprehension born out of uncertainty and perceptions of risk. And one of the contrasts that's been made over the past few days and weeks is between Trump and Reagan. And of course, I think I might be the only member of the panel who's actually old enough to have lived as a mature scholar through the Reagan years. And there was a great deal of apprehension, a great deal of uncertainty, and the idea, remembering this was a Cold War period, that there would be untoward consequences, and this would matter a great deal in terms of not only economic policy, and we may be able to come back to that in discussion, but also in terms of security policy. In the case of Trump, the apprehension is accompanied in many ways by a preoccupation with things that have nothing to do with Donald Trump at all, because the European project itself and European integration and the European Union is experiencing a period of turbulence, a period in which major countries are all holding elections and where populist parties of the right or the left have a good deal of leverage, and where a number of issues, migration, obviously the potential or the actual leaving of the EU by Britain have caused internal uncertainty. This is not the first time this has happened. Back in the 1970s and in the 1980s, there were also periods of great uncertainty in European integration, and these had an impact on transatlantic relations. Third point, leadership and followership. US leadership matters, and of course, from a European point of view, the leaderships of all European Union member states, and there are still 28, have their own particular take on the Trump leadership. In common with a number of other presidencies, the new leadership has caused a period of perceptions of risk, economic and security, potential costs, and has raised issues of trust, the extent to which the US leadership can be trusted and the extent to which they trust European leaders. And the meeting between President Trump and Angela Merkel a few weeks ago was one in which was widely interpreted as displaying the kind of antagonism and hostility that there might be, particularly to Germany as a leading country in Europe. On the other side, European followership is an issue. If the Americans are going to exert leadership, how are the Europeans equipped to actually follow or to comply or to play their full part in cooperation with the United States? And it has to be said that the Europeans, for reasons I've just stated, are in a period of introspection where their resources for contributing to an active Atlantic partnership are not always as strong as they might be. And of course, that plays into a number of the particular issues affecting European introspection that I talked about a few seconds ago. So we have seen things like this before, not necessarily quite as chaotic, to quote a number of American newspapers that I've read, but we have seen them before, and they do raise common questions of leadership and followership. But the other point I want to make is that this is not all about Washington and Brussels, or the national capitals in Europe. Transatlantic relations rest on a huge infrastructure of transgovernmental relations and networks between officials in governments on both sides of the Atlantic, and transnational relations between branches of companies, networks of economic actors and groups, non-governmental organizations and so on both sides of the Atlantic. So although we may be seeing turbulence or imagined turbulence maybe at the governmental level, that doesn't necessarily always translate down into the deep structure of transatlantic relations. And indeed, some of the appointments that have come out of the Trump administration so far have in a way been appointments straight out of that deep infrastructure in defense and so on, which have actually reassured Europeans in important ways. So I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Thank you for this good opening. So next I will turn to Professor Alistair Young, who will give us the specific view in terms of sort of trade relations across the pond.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Alison, for organizing this. So what I'm going to do briefly is touch on the Trump administration's trade policy in general, and then focus on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiation, which was the centerpiece of transatlantic economic policy during the second Obama administration, and which has suddenly sort of perhaps maybe not lurched to life. So during and since the campaign, Donald Trump expressed hostility toward trade, blaming foreign competition for the loss of U.S. jobs. He was particularly scornful of U.S. trade agreements, most notably the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, TPP, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and China's accession to the WTO, which he claimed were bad deals for America. On the campaign trail, he did not criticize TTIP, although that might be because, in the words of one commission official, he did not know that TTIP was a thing. Since the administration has come into office, trade policy has been in flux. As in other areas, the record is shorter on policies than on declarations and initiatives. But watching those declarations and initiatives can induce whiplash. On April 2nd, Trump described China as world champions of currency manipulation. 10 days later, he said they weren't. The situation with NAFTA is even more volatile. Last week, in a matter of hours, the administration went from leaking that it was going to withdraw from NAFTA to saying it was going to renegotiate to saying that it would renegotiate but would pull out if it wasn't happy with the conclusions. There have also been a number of executive orders with protectionist intent, calls for an analysis of bilateral trade deficits, calling for stiffer enforcement of Buy American provisions in government procurement, considering imposing duties on steel and aluminum on national security grounds, introducing this weekend a performance review of trade agreements, including the World Trade Organization, to assess whether they are, quote unquote, working for America. Other initiatives have suggested a unilateralist approach. In February, the U.S. Trade Representative the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, because we don't have one yet, was instructed to investigate other ways of pursuing foreign trade barriers without resorting to the World Trade Organization. And there are indications from the administration that it would not necessarily feel bound by World Trade Organization rules. But thus far, it's far more in terms of investigations and suggestions rather than policies. Nonetheless, the mood music for trade is not promising. As with the rest of the Trump agenda, the shifts make it hard to know where trade policy is going. But it does seem to be more protectionist and more unilateralist in tenor than has been the recent case. So what about TTIP? In January, Peter Navarro, who was then the head of Donald Trump's National Trade Council, he's now the head of the Office of Trade and Manufacturing, said that the TTIP negotiations had been killed by Brexit. European officials have been marginally more optimistic. In December, the European Union's Trade Commissioner, Cecily Malmström, described the negotiations as in the freezer. This characterization has been echoed by numerous other trade officials on ice, versions like that. But that suggests the negotiations might be defrosted in due course. The early signs were not good. The President's 27 trade policy agenda, which was issued in March, made no reference to TTIP, the EU, or any EU member state. Also in March, the European Commission informed its TTIP advisory group that there had been no formal engagement with the new administration on TTIP and announced that it was suspending the group. Then the spring thaw. So on the 22nd of April, the Times of London reported, based on several interviews in the administration and in Europe, that the Trump administration was softening on the idea of launching negotiations with the EU. The following day, in an interview with the Financial Times, the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, ahead of a meeting with Malmström, indicated the same thing. After that meeting, Malmström said, quote, "I hope TTIP will come out of the freezer, but the new administration needs a bit more time to look at it and to assess it and to get acquainted with it, and they haven't done that yet." So what might be the prospects of TTIP? Channeling my inner magic 8-ball, I would say the outlook is not so good. First, it is important to recognize that the negotiations were disappointing before Donald Trump was elected president. We've seen unprecedented opposition to the trade agreement in the European Union, which spilled over into the comprehensive economic and trade agreement with Canada and almost saw it fail to be signed. Was an issue with the U.S. being unwilling or unable to make concessions on key EU objectives, including on public procurement, which led the French trade minister to call for the negotiations to be abandoned way back in August. The second reason for a lack of optimism is that the reason the Trump administration wants to engage in a trade negotiation with the European Union is that it wants to reduce its trade deficit with the EU and particularly Germany, which is the second largest, the US is second largest after that with China. So it's viewing the negotiations very much in relative terms gains and heavy emphasis on the distributional implications. The US wants to export more, import less with Europe. Not a particularly appealing proposition for the Europeans. There's also a very strong hostility to domestic trade liberalization in the United States, which means that they'll be approaching the negotiations for a fundamentally different position than the European Union and, must be said, the Obama administration. A third reason for caution is that the unilateral trade initiatives that the Trump administration has hinted at have signaled that the U.S. is moving away from the EU's objectives, most notably with stricter enforcement of the Buy American provisions. Fourthly, given the ability of European civil society organizations to foment opposition to TTIP, when the United States was led by Barack Obama, who had an activist environmental agenda, the prospects under Donald Trump, who is arguably trying to unravel the deregulatory state and has an actively anti-environmental position, seems to be a long shot. So what can I conclude at this stage? One, is there's scant chance that there will be transatlantic trade negotiations. If any negotiations do begin, they will be harder than they were before. It will be a much less ambitious, less valuable, and less threatening agreement. And even that, I think, is unlikely. I do expect to see an increase in transatlantic trade conflicts, particularly over the US use of trade defense instruments. We also have fun things like WTO rulings on Boeing Airbus subsidies looming. And we have had periods of conflict before. In the late 80s under Ronald Reagan, as Mike alluded to, and during the second Clinton administration. Reagan preceded the WTO, and the conflicts under coming up might be more fraught than those under Clinton because there is a real risk of US non-compliance with WTO rulings leading to retaliation and a general escalation of trade tensions. The most likely area for cooperation between the United States and the European Union, I think, would be with respect to coordinating their actions with response to China. But here, the EU would only be willing to act through the World Trade Organization, and I think the United States has lost its confidence there. Therefore, I expect a rocky road ahead for the transatlantic trading relationship.
Great, wonderful. Thank you. There's, I'm sure, a lot to talk about in the next phase of our roundtable. But now I want to give the word to Kathleen McGinnis. She will brief us on the current security relationship.
Well, thank you, Marcus, for having me here, and thank you to Alison and Christine for organizing this. It really is a pleasure to be here. I should note that any views that are expressed, they're not representative of the United States government. They're solely my own, and I'm going to be speaking specifically today to security, national security matters, not broader political or foreign policy questions. With that in mind, with those caveats out there, despite the campaign rhetoric, the White House seems to be trending towards what we would know as a normal European transatlantic security policy. Still, on a lot of fronts, from a policy brass tacks perspective, it's still too early to tell what direction we are truly going to go in. That's for a couple of reasons that have to do with both how things are shaking out in Washington and in Europe. In Washington, we still do not have a full national security team in DoD or the State Department. Although with respect to the European NATO policy in both DoD and state, there are some experienced NATO hands that are being nominated or appointed to key positions. We don't yet have a budget. When administrations change, they tend to take a little bit longer to prepare their budgets. We're expecting a release of the president's budget on 22 May, so we'll have a firmer sense of what the president's priorities will be then. Another outstanding question mark on the national security strategy process is actually mandated in last year's National Defense Authorization Act, which overhauled the DoD strategy process altogether. So there's a little bit of a pickup game that has to be played in that front, and that's expected. There was also significant reforms to the organizational design of the Pentagon itself that was undertaken last year, and so again, there's a little bit of a pickup game being played there. They're still getting up to speed, and again, that's normal. We now have a president who has, frankly, never before in his career had to consider national security matters in this way or the intricacies of policy. So that does suggest that there is a fair amount of on-the-job training right now. And we have a Congress right now that has its own views on national security matters that may or may not diverge from those of the administration. But because we haven't seen the strategies and we haven't seen the budgets, it's not quite clear yet where those alignments and divergences might be. In Europe, there's also some pretty key question marks. For example, will Brexit proceed? And if so, what is that going to mean for the UK's ability to participate in NATO, the special relationship, meet 2% targets, so on and so forth? There's, who's going to win the French election? Obviously a big question. There's been a lot of work done in recent years to refurbish the US-French security relationship, and that's been going very well. So there's questions about whether that election will change that. There's also questions about Turkey's recent political developments and its impacts on its relationships with NATO, how it's going to be contributing to the coalition to counter the Islamic State, things like that. So again, there's big questions on both sides. But against this backdrop, there's obviously a huge range of security challenges that both sides of the Atlantic have to grapple with. And just a short list of examples include, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and it's spreading to places like Libya and beyond. We have an aggressive Russia that is clearly underwhelmed with NATO's eastward expansion. There's information and propaganda campaigns that are apparently designed to call into question our democracies. Afghanistan, as we've seen through testimonies by both General Nicholson and Sakir, Afghanistan is considered at a stalemate now, in part because the Islamic State spread there. And there's also anti-access and area denial challenges in the Baltics and the Black Sea. So bringing a naval maritime dimension to these challenges as well. Well, neither Washington nor Brussels had the luxury to wait and see how it's going to shake out. You got, these challenges are pressing. We've got to start figuring out how to contend with these challenges. And so, so far, what we're seeing so far is pretty much a continuation of pre-existing policies, although there's some degrees. There's degrees of shifts, not radical policy shifts so far. Congress has fully funded the European Reassurance or Deterrence Initiative, depending on who you speak to, and Operation Atlantic Resolve, which is the U.S. operation to maintain a continuous rotational presence in Europe. It continues apace, and we're, the next brigade is in line and spinning up to backfill the current ones out there. The Warsaw Agreed Enhanced Forward Presence battalions in the Baltic are in place and operating. I had the chance to visit the German one in Lithuania a couple weeks ago. It's a really important step, and it's functioning very well. President Trump, after meeting with Secretary General Stoltenberg and Secretary Mattis, endorsed the view that NATO remains relevant and is going to be attending a major meeting in Brussels at the end of this month. On Islamic State, Syria, Iraq, it appears that we're going to be have a somewhat more aggressive campaign than during the Obama administration, but it's certainly not going to be, does not look to be something like an Operation Iraqi Freedom level kind of commitment. One area that does seem like it's being re-examined is Russia. There's another deconfliction protocol that we're looking at for Syria that's apparently being worked now. But even in this area, it seems like we were seeing a little bit more of the same. Every administration has come in recent decades, coming in with trying to reset the U.S. relationship with Russia. And it hasn't succeeded for a variety of reasons, including the fact that the U.S. and Russia have very different national security priorities and interests. Finally, at the same time, there's some real outstanding challenges to the alliance, and certainly from the Washington perspective, the 2% target is critically important. NATO allies are moving in the direction of meeting the spend 2% of your gross domestic product on defense target. Some allies are moving in that direction. That seems to be tracking in the right way. But if that fails to be met, I think we can. Secretary Mattis said it very clearly that the United States will have to reconsider its commitment to European security if those targets aren't met. So with all of this in mind, it's going to be very interesting to see how the meeting at the end of this month in Brussels is going to play out. But so far, it does seem like on the transatlantic relations aspect of this security policy, we're seeing more continuity than change.
Okay, thank you for your views. Now we're going to go back, and we have a couple of questions that we want to work through. But before we go to these questions, I just want to give you a quick reminder that if you have any questions during the talk that you want to have answered at the end of our session, please use the chat icon on the right hand of the screen so that we can then hopefully at the end address these. But now let's go back to the broader framework of transatlantic relations. And so I want to ask Professor Mike Smith, given that there have been a number of earlier transatlantic crises affecting the US and the EU, or previously than the European community, what, if anything, is different about the current crisis? Is it more, so can we understand it more in a cyclical, structural way, or is it just part of working out of the changes that we have in terms of complex global interdependence?
That's a very good question. If you think that it's cyclical, then you'll agree with quite a lot of what I said earlier on, which is that we've seen quite a number of these things before. but there are a number of important twists in this particular case which arise out of the particular preoccupations both in the United States and in the European Union. And we have, and it's very easy to be what you might describe as presentist here, you know, what's happening this week in Washington and so on, or in Brussels. But I think we have a situation in which the preoccupation of policymakers, both in Washington and in Brussels, with what might be described as domestic policies, as internal preoccupations, is something that is at a very high level. Now, actually, as Kathleen has just said, a lot of the other things that are day-to-day and that have long-term implications carry on. But you can see some of the implications in what Alistair just said about the changing atmosphere surrounding trade policy and the changing sets of interests surrounding change policy and playing out, particularly in Washington. So on the cyclical front, we've seen things like this before, but not necessarily with the same level of chaos or introspection and preoccupation. Structurally, of course, you know, we might compare it with Ronald Reagan, but actually, of course, the world is different. We have a major power shift within the global arena, part of which, of course, fed into the US presidential election. We have a sense in some quarters that the EU and the US are kind of drifting apart because of preoccupation in the EU with their neighborhood and the preoccupation in the United States with what's happening on the Pacific front. And we have a long-term preoccupation with domestic issues and domestic political structures. On the complex interdependence front, this is an idea, of course, that comes from a long time ago. But some people would argue that the more interdependence you have between the European Union and the United States, both in security and in economic issues, the more you're likely to get crises because simply of the kind of interactions that take place and the frictions that take place within, you know, what you might describe as a close-knit family. But of course, the resolution of those issues depends upon basic levels of trust, convergence of values, and institutions in which people believe. And I think one of the issues at the minute is the question of which institutions people believe in for managing these issues and which they don't believe in.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good answer. So with regards then to the leadership on both sides of the Atlantic, and you were referring to that earlier, so I want to really probe you a little bit more on that. Is the US still capable and willing to be sort of the leader? And the vice versa then, is the EU still experience the problem of followership? Or how do you situate both partners here?
Well, US leadership has always been an issue, and what you might describe as the risks and potential costs associated with the US leadership have been a European leader's preoccupation for a very long time. The idea that US leadership might lead you into situations which cost you in security terms or cost you in economic terms. I do think you need to make a distinction between the economic and the security areas. Because in the economic area, at least in recent times, the European Union has been capable in many ways of operating on the same basis as the United States, as a kind of partner, whether or not it's an adversarial partner or not, but on a relatively equal level with the United States. In security, of course, that's very different. There is no European security presence of a kind that would give it an equal standing with the United States. Although there are new security areas, particularly those involving police cooperation, various forms of institutional developments, that give the European Union more of a voice than it's had in the past. So the further you get towards hard security, the further the United States is dominant. And then the question of US leadership is how it chooses to exercise that dominance and impose that dominance, if you like, on the Europeans. But it's not all one-sided. There are European countries, and of course I come from one of them, that have special relationships with the United States. And in the case of the United Kingdom, of course, it's been one of the ways in which they've tried to rationalise leaving the European Union, that we will have an even more special relationship with the United States, both in trade and economic policy and in security. Now, of course, we can't know what's going to happen there. It won't emerge in many ways for a number of years. But the Donald Trump that we initially saw, that seemed not to care very much about the Atlantic Partnership, thought NATO was obsolete, and actively rang round European leaders wondering which the next one to exit the European Union would be, that Donald Trump appears to have disappeared, at least temporarily. So it may well be that the kind of established mechanisms have reasserted themselves to a certain extent, but that doesn't do away with the fact that the question of American leadership will always be there. It's going to be there in security in a different way from in trade and economic policy, but the complicating factor of the United States attraction, Trump administration's attraction towards Moscow, and the ways in which that might play out, has at least receded to the background temporarily.
Great, thank you. One more question that I'd like to pose for you that refers to sort of both counterparts, the Brussels as well as Washington. So is it just a crisis between the US and the EU in terms of is it an intergovernmental crisis just affecting these two parts, whilst at the same time on a transgovernmental and transnational, maybe economic level, the process of transatlantic relations go on with business as usual, or?
Oh yeah, we've seen this before, and I referred to it in my opening remarks, that if you take what most people, I guess, would say was the most severe transatlantic crisis of recent years, over the war in Iraq, roughly between 2002 and 2005. There are two things that were notable about that. Number one, if you looked at the figures for economic transactions, for example, investment in the European Union and investment by Europeans in the United States, not a lot actually changed during that crisis. And number two, of course, that although there was a very severe crisis and it actually split the European Union in quite important ways, it didn't take very long for the underlying structures to reassert themselves and to re-establish the kind of institutional framework and the trust in the institutional framework that had been challenged. That's governmental. My argument would definitely be that at the level of transgovernmental relations, which is the relationships between officials in Washington and in European capitals, in Brussels, both NATO and the European Union, and Kathleen referred to this to a certain extent, there hasn't been a fundamental challenge to those relationships, at least not yet. It may emerge. So transgovernmentally, we see a great deal of strength in the relationship, and transnationally, we see a lot of strength in the relationship, which may be disrupted to a certain extent by the patterns that might follow on from Brexit, changes in investment patterns, changes in trade agreements and institutions and so on. But transnationally, there's a huge amount of strength because of the sheer depth of European involvement in the United States and the United States involvement in the European Union, but also in the wider Europe around the European Union. So I'm not trying to sound like some sort of foolish optimist, but I do think that the substructure is more resilient than the superstructure might appear to be at some times.
Great, thank you, appreciate it. So now I'm going to turn to Alistair Young, and our specialist on trade issues. And a little bit, Alistair, in contrast to what Mike just said about the underlying basic consistency of the policy infrastructure that's in place, why do you think that the administration's trade policy has fluctuated so much since coming into office early this year?
Well, I think part of it has to do with, Kathleen was referred to on-the-job training, and I think that there's quite a lot of that going on. All administrations have face a learning curve And this administration faces a particularly steep one, given the unusually, with the exception of the security field, with an exceptionally inexperienced and fairly shallow team. There was, apparently Angela Merkel had to explain to Donald Trump that you can't conduct trade negotiations with individual EU member states, and so that's finally what unjammed the idea, well, maybe you'd be interested in having one with the EU, because we can't have one with the UK and we can't do one with Germany, so I guess then we have to do one with the EU. And there also seems to be an element of not having anticipated some concerted opposition from pro-trade groups. This sort of seems to be part of the story about the rowback on NAFTA was suddenly corn farmers sort of saying, oi, that would not be very good for us. So that's one side of the story. Another side of the story is in his earlier career, Trump was known for making extreme statements as an opening bid and then rowing back to a different position. He talks about this in The Art of the Deal. The New York Times last week had an article entitled The Art of the Bluff, which was talking about the application of this in politics and pointing out that it doesn't work quite so well in politics because the reputational costs are much greater, because a lot of people are listening to you make that thing rather than just the person you're talking to. And this is kind of the thing that the White House has depicted with NAFTA. The threat to abandon it was really about forcing Canada and Mexico to the negotiating table, and once they were willing to come, then the administration could row back on it. You didn't have to go that far, though all indications were that both Canada and Mexico have been waiting for the U.S. to get its act together to come and talk about NAFTA, because they're open to it. They just actually want to have the negotiations. And then a third explanation that appears quite a lot is that you have competition between rival camps within the administration, particularly sort of the more internationalist wing, which is Jared Kushner and Gary Cohn at National Economic Council, sometimes Steve Mnuchin at the Treasury, and then sort of the America First wing, headed by Steve Bannon, also Peter Navarro, who I already mentioned. Wilbur Ross Commerce has fairly strong protectionist inclinations, but has been representing on behalf of interests that are concerned about, too protectionist a trade policy. So, I think there are elements of all three of these going on. Some, in one instance, one might explain; in other instances, they might be mutually reinforcing. But there is certainly a lot of churn on trade policy at the moment.
Thank you. That's a great differentiated answer. Now, one more question, and I want to hear kind of sort of bringing not only TTIP, which is the 900-pound gorilla, but basically I'm asking you to explain a little bit more about what are the most likely sources of transatlantic trade tensions in the short term to medium term, right? And maybe just to throw in sort of potential implications of Brexit there as well, right? Because that definitely has an impact on the European continental side as well.
It's like you're trying to get two questions into one.
Exactly. Our time is running.
In terms of the most likely sources of transatlantic trade tension, one will be signs that the United States is going to make more active use of trade defense instruments. This hasn't happened that much yet. The reimposition of countervailing duties on softwood lumber in Canada is sort of a tradition in U.S. trade policy, so that's not that distinctive. But the United States is in the process of conducting an investigation into anti-dumping duties on steel, which includes 5 EU member states, including France and Germany. And Germany has already called, they haven't even been formalized, and Germany has already called for the EU to launch a WTO complaint against the US for the methodology it's using. The idea of using national security to restrict steel imports would hit the Europeans as well, so that's going to be an area of tension. The Europeans will be very unhappy if the United States goes back to pursuing trade disputes unilaterally rather than through the World Trade Organization. And there's the issue of the U.S. Resistance to WTO disciplines, the trade policy agenda, and Robert Lighthizer, who's the nominee for U.S. Trade Representative in his confirmation testimony, both expressed the sense that the World Trade Organization had gone beyond its what had been negotiated, and they didn't really feel bound to comply with what they hadn't initially agreed to. So those are the sort of the most likely sources of tension. Brexit, I don't think Brexit makes a huge difference in terms of the long-term negotiation. It reduces the importance of the EU to the United States. The UK accounts for 14% of EU GDP, larger proportions of US investment in the EU and European investment in the US. So with those out of the equation, TTIP, the EU becomes a less attractive negotiating partner for the US. It also removes one of the key champions of a transatlantic trade agreement from the EU side. So both of those things are sort of bad news for TTIP, and they'll probably make it less likely there's going to be resumed, but I'm not sure that makes a margin, it's more the margins rather than the center. I mean, the other issue is that the process of Brexit itself is using up political capital, which is not available for investing in something like relaunching the TTIP negotiations. If the negotiations have been humming along, if we had a Clinton administration and it could have just continued to be running largely at the transgovernmental level, then I don't think Brexit would have affected the negotiations. But now that you need political commitment to restart the negotiations, I think Brexit will create a sufficient distraction. So that's how I think.
Good, thank you, appreciate it. So now we want to turn to the security issues. And Kathleen, given the disruption of the policy infrastructure, the underlying, do we see significant differences between the US and European security policies in the near to long-term future?
So I think it's important to note that, it appears to me that we're seeing differences by degrees, and that there's a fair degree of continuity, but budgetary and fiscal realities have exacerbated those differences in national security priorities. So it doesn't seem to me to be a strategic decision or trend. It's more fiscally driven. What do I mean by that? Well, the United States has traditionally had a more global perspective on international security matters, and Europe, by virtue of its geography, has had a more regional perspective. So structurally, there's a difference in how the two sides of the Atlantic look at security matters. But in 2011, we had the Budget Control Act in Washington, and that's been subsequently amended, which caps the amount of money that can be spent on defense and security. And so as a result of that, with the cap on spending, even though we're spending around $600 billion a year, my colleagues at CRS have the real figures, but even though we're spending that much money, it's done in such a way that we can't modernize, we can't invest, and we can't. It's very difficult to move resources and priorities from one place to another and from one program to another. So this is having a big impact on readiness. This is having a big impact on procurement, and frankly, it's also having a big impact on where the United States can focus its priorities and how. So these fiscal realities have really forced these trade-offs within the Department of Defense and the national security community, and so maybe exacerbated perhaps existing differences of perspective on national security priorities.
Okay, thank you. So then, to what extent are the current tensions on security policy a unique reaction to the Trump administration, or are they a reflection or even continuation of broader geopolitical trends?
Well, I mean, to follow on from Michael's point about being leader versus following, the tensions again seem to be a difference of degrees. With the W. Bush administration, there was certainly a lot of anxiety about the United States being too aggressive in its leadership. When I was at Chatham House in London, I heard a lot of concerns about the Obama administration not exerting enough leadership in the international center. So it's almost like you're never going to win that that debate. And so there's always been a skepticism, and it's probably healthy about what the U.S. role in the world ought to be and how it should be exercising that role. But I think that one of the unique things about right now is on the security side of the portfolio is that I had the sense when I was in London that a lot of people really expected candidate Clinton to win this election, and there was a huge policy infrastructure that went along with that. Her positions were very clear. And there was a sense of there was going to be a continuity of policy across the two administrations. And Trump, as a result, was understudied as a political actor. And so, so now there's these questions. Now that Trump has been elected, he's the United States president. There's now these questions. People are sort of getting up to speed on their homework, and there's questions about what he's meant and what does it all actually mean. And frankly, we're really not going to know until we have a national security strategy, until we have a national defense strategy, until we have a budget. We're not really going to see what all of this means. And so those are the things to look for.
Great, thanks. I want to ask one more question before we open it up to any questions that we may have gotten. And again, if you have any questions in the meantime, please use the chat icon on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll try to address these. What about two other major players in the security realm? And hereby I refer to NATO, right? The role of NATO. Will NATO weather these tensions? We've seen, as you said already, some sort of reversals of announcements and Twitter tweets. And also a little bit, maybe you can say a little bit about Russia, right? The role of Russia as just a sort of impacting both the European Union as a whole as well as the US.
Well, sure. I mean, certainly on the NATO side of things, will NATO weather this? And if so, how? Well, NATO has been, demonstrated over the past 25 years or longer that it's a remarkably resilient organization. It's moved from a deterrence, Cold War deterrence posture to doing expeditionary out of area operations in the Hindu Kush. That's huge. And now that we have a resurgent Russia, that's certainly challenging NATO's posture, but there's also challenges to the south. There's the MENA region is definitely unstable. The organization it's adapting to try to be able to simultaneously meet the needs of its members that are quite different. Italy has a very different perspective on what's a key national security priority than does Poland or does Lithuania. So it's figuring out the way to meet all of its members' needs in a way that meets that shares the burden effectively. So from that perspective, it's got a great track record, and it seems to be moving in the right direction to the satisfaction of a lot of its allies. But I would note that there are some question marks. The first one, as I pointed out earlier, it's this 2% target. I mean, Washington cares about the 2% target, and its willingness to continually reinvest in the European security project very much depends on whether or not those goals are met. There's a lot of quibbling about whether or not it's an effective target in the national security circles that I run in. We're just, not sure if that's input-output metrics, all that. Whatever, it's done. That train's left the station, 2%. So that's really important. Another point that NATO probably needs to grapple with is this question about what is its appropriate roles and responsibilities in this emerging security environment, and not from a geographic perspective, but actually in a functional perspective. So you look at hybrid warfare. You look at there's civilian and military instruments that are being utilized to conduct hybrid warfare. Police mission, influence operations, information. It's all of these things that are not necessarily the realm of the military to solve. But NATO is a military alliance. We saw this in Afghanistan. The NATO militaries were responsible for providing security, and the civilian actors in government were responsible for providing the governance and development and other aspects of the mission there. It was supposed to all be brought together in this comprehensive approach. Well, looking forward, there's with NATO as a military alliance, and with these questions, these hybrid activities that have these security implications, what is the role for NATO as an organization when it's primarily military, or do we need to reconstruct what that role is as a part of this adaptability project? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's one that the alliance has to grapple with.
Great, thank you. So now we have a few more minutes left, and before I'm going to ask you more questions, I think we do have questions from the audience. So if I could just have...
I can just read it out.
Please, Alison, if you would.
Yeah, so we have a couple questions. The first is, and I think it's looking separate from NATO, Are there any early indications of a new push from EU countries to substantially strengthen their defense capabilities, thereby decreasing dependence on the US? And if so, what would be the implications of such a European military buildup?
When I first got involved in this field in the late 90s, we were looking at the same question. So, Common Foreign and Security Policy, ESDI, all sorts of things. And so, maybe this is just a reflection of just sort of seeing this before. So I'm a little bit skeptical about whether or not that will meaningfully result in a challenge to the transatlantic relationship on security matters. However, it's, all for the good if European partners and allies invest in their defense capabilities, find ways to diversify so that the sum is greater than the whole of its parts. You know what I'm saying? Not enough power. But those kinds of questions have been worked for years. So I think there's a general sense that rising tide floats all boats. If that can move in the right direction, that's great. But challenging the United States and transit, there's just too much going on. There's too many critical issues. I mean, the time for the theology between EU versus NATO, it seems to me that that's sort of a legacy of the past.
I think you're absolutely right that what has emerged is a system of a kind of framework within which various forms of ad hoc cooperation could take place. We're not looking for some great transatlantic bargain. The one thing I would say, of course, is that Brexit is going to be almost whichever way you see it, a net deduction from any security capabilities in the EU. Now, of course, you can say there will be all sorts of practical agreements, you can make it work and so on, but there will be a distancing. The British, of course, are placing a lot of bets on NATO, not just traditional NATO, but the one you just talked about. But there will be an effect. The oddness of this effect may be that institutionally the European Union could go further than it would have done if the British had been sitting there saying, oh, well, we don't know about this and so on. But actually their capabilities may well be lower. So the institutional perfectionists in the EU may get some joy out of this, but the actual capacity to influence events in real-world crisis or other situations, there may be a net deficit.
And just, in terms of NATO's capability, the world has never seen an integrated military staff the way NATO has today, that is capable of integrating partners from around the world. I mean, it's hard to underscore that enough. So it's hard to see how a European Union organization could match that to meet the huge swath of challenges that are before both Europe and the United States.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to another question.
Oh, if there was one
We have one more coming from the audience online. And it asked about trade and security, but I think the security part was just answered. So let's think about this in terms of trade. So there seems to be a lot of uncertainty on the U.S. side of the transatlantic relationship across policies. What is the best way to deal with this uncertainty for the EU? Would it be more productive if the EU is more or less assertive in matters of trade, and how assertive can it really afford to be?
Big picture. You want to go first?
Well, the EU tends to be, in terms of its international role, it is more assertive in trade than in most areas. It's not been particularly assertive with respect to the U.S. in the past. The EU, if it has a trade issue with the United States, tries to negotiate it, and if that doesn't work, it will file WTO complaint. The interesting, I think, there will be, and the decision whether or not to initiate a WTO complaint is a political one, and it's not just about the economic interests involved. And though I think one of the things that will come into the calculations in the European Union, because it's primarily the Commission leading on this, is the issue the economic issue worth bringing a trade agreement that they're sure the United States will ignore and thus risk jeopardizing the system, right? Because the EU is really heavily invested in the WTO. And so it's going to want to avoid doing things that would disrupt the agreement. So there may be a little bit of caution in trying to push the U.S. too hard. But at the same time, if you don't actually enforce the rules, the system doesn't work either. And it's not valuable anymore. So there is going to be a very awkward trade-off. But I think that's going to become much more of a political calculation than it has been in the past.
Thank you. And I think we may have time for one more question.
My question is similar to the last one. How would the EU respond to Trump's protectionist measures in regards to trade?
Through the WTO cautiously.
I make just a couple more points that they would respond pretty negatively to a border adjustment tax of the kind that has been thrown around.
Yeah, that seems to have disappeared.
May re-emerge next week.
Who knows?
But the other thing is, of course, that in terms of competition with the United States, a lot of that competition doesn't take place just between the EU and the United States. It takes place over what you might describe as third regions or whatever. And there has, of course, been a great tendency for the EU and the US, and China for that matter, to try and conclude either bilateral or interregional free trade agreements. So if there was the real, one of the effects of US protectionism might be to exacerbate that competition or to accelerate that competition. There are still regions which are not tied up, so to speak. That would again, as Alistair said, feed back into, well, what's the WTO for now that this kind of competition is taking place, or people are acting outside the WTO altogether.
And the Trump administration's shift away from trade agreements and doing things like withdrawing from the TPP is ceding the field to the EU and China.
Yeah.
Thank you. So now that we're basically running out of time, or we're over time, maybe, Alison, can we have one more short question?
The last question came in was just about what was just answered. So.
But yeah, there was one more question from the audience.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Make it security, because I could have, I was wondering with the rising, I guess the interest in Europe in having a more robust defense capability of its own in response to the Balkans crisis, right, in the 90s. Hopefully we're not seeing that again, but there certainly seems to be some rising instability in the neighborhood, right, with Macedonia and Kosovo. Whether or not it's being fomented by Russia, certainly it's being exacerbated or encouraged, we can say, safely. Previous administrations might have been more willing to lend NATO support, even at the risk of antagonizing Russia on this issue. Trump more likely would not be willing to get involved, being more isolationist in general, except in the Middle East, apparently. But I think certainly with his posture toward Russia is more accommodating. What might be the response of the European Union to these crises that, at least in Macedonia in particular, there's a real risk of some violence erupting more broadly?
So, to answer that, certainly from the U.S. perspective, as I've been saying, it's still too early to tell. But it's noteworthy that the Macedonia was accepted by the United States as a possible new member of NATO. So that is an indicator, but we still have to wait to see how things are going to shake out. But the Balkans has always been in the view of a number of administrations, like a more European problem than a United States problem. And so it's going to be up to the European Union to figure out how to address this, as near as I can tell. And especially given all of the other critical national, we've got North Korea right now, we've got big questions in Asia, we've got with scarce, limited resources, shortfalls in readiness, shortfalls for all of these different challenges, I don't necessarily, and I could be totally wrong about this because we don't know what we don't know yet.
I mean,
but it just doesn't seem like it's going to rate.
yeah. And I mean, I would suggest that we have seen already an increased focus on the Balkans, at least over the past half year or so, right? From the side of the EU. Not only with visa liberalization, but also, you know, they're increasing push towards accession, visa liberalization, and so on.
Of course, Jean-Claude Juncker made this direct link by saying, you know, if you want to break up the European Union, this was Trump indirectly, then you're going to get another war in the Balkans. And whether you make that link as directly as he did, I think that now the fact that the president seems to think the EU is a wonderful organisation may or may not have anything to do with that.
You have to wonder whether he is interested in the Balkans. Or one might, a cynic might say, does he know where it is?
Yeah, he does. He knows. He's married to the Slovenian.
On this note, before it gets out of hand, I'd like to see if there were any concluding thoughts that you would like to, quick concluding thoughts that you would like to give us here. Otherwise,
the one thing,
yes, please.
The one thing I would say that we've touched on is that the contrasting approaches to global governance in areas such as environmental relations and so on, human rights, that have been apparent over recent years are going to be an issue again, not long beyond this 100 days, because any differences that there were before are now multiplied between the EU and the United States on the commitment to the support of the promotion of global governance mechanisms.
Very good point. Thank you.
Just to once again underscore the point that we're still in wait and see mode. We read, as particularly from Washington, and while there's a lot of chatter and there's tweets and there appears to be a lot of stray voltage about what the United States wants to do or the direction that we're going to go in. Frankly, we're not going to know until we understand the documents, the strategy, and particularly the budget.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
The crystal ball is still cloudy. Ask again later.
I guess we could reconvene probably in another 100 days or so if you're so interested. But I definitely want to thank you three for coming and sharing your knowledge with us. And I want to thank all the participating universities, schools, and individual participants for participating as well and joining, and our audience here. And I hope you have a good rest of the week. Thank you for coming.